The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining Your Hour with APA Virginia, sponsored by the Berkeley Group. Your Hour with APA Virginia is hosted on the fourth Monday of each month from noon to 1 p.m. We are going to give everyone a minute to log in and get settled. Alrighty. Thank you again for joining our webinar today. Before we get started, we want to remind you of a couple of exciting things APA Virginia has coming up and a couple housekeeping items as well. Out of an abundance of caution, we've made a shift in dates for the conference. The conference will now be held September 13th through the 16th, 2020. Please mark your calendars. It will still take place at the Richmond Marriott downtown. Please stay on the lookout for more information regarding programming and mobile tours. We will maintain the same format as we usually do each July. In other conference news, the deadline for the APA Virginia Awards has been extended to Friday, March 27th. Please submit all nominations to awards@apavirginia.com. Additional information can be found on apavirginia.com, which is this website right here. As we do every month, this webinar, The Basics of New Markets Tax Credit, will be recorded and posted to the YouTube page by the end of the day. We encourage you to visit our YouTube and see past webinars or share it with colleagues. As a reminder, we will hold questions until the end, but as the webinar is going on, feel free to type your questions in the questions box on your dashboard, and we will answer them at the end in the order they came in. Again, thank you to the Berkeley Group for making this webinar series possible. We are always looking for new webinar presenters or topics. If you have one you would like us to use or know of a topic or anyone who was slated to present at the APA National Conference, please email admin@apavirginia.com. As a reminder, please look to our website and social media for updates on all chapter events and engagement opportunities. This month's webinar, The Basics of New Markets Tax Credit, is presented by Emma Wyatt. The NMTC program incentivizes private investment in low-income communities by permitting individual and corporate investors to receive a tax credit against their federal income tax return in exchange for making equity investments in low-income communities. NMTCs are a great tool to assist in funding large-scale community development projects, but the complexities of deal structures often prove challenging. This presentation will introduce what the New Markets Tax Credit Program is, how funding through a NMTC deal identify the advantages of the leverage structure, and review much more content designed to educate project sponsors on using NMTC to help fund their community development projects. Our presenter today, Emma Wyatt, is a community development specialist for People Incorporated of Virginia, a community action agency and community development corporation headquartered in Abingdon, Virginia. In this role, she provides technical assistance and project development advisory services to businesses and community organizations undertaking transformative community development projects, specifically in regards to the new markets tax credits. Emma has a BS in Applied Economics, a BA in Public and Urban Affairs, and a Master of Urban and Regional Planning from Virginia Tech. Previously, Emma worked as a town planner in Culpeper, Virginia. At this time, I will now hand over the screen to our presenter. And again, please hold all questions until the end.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining the conference webinar today, especially in light of everything that's going on. I know a lot of us have alternative work situations, and a lot of us might be working from home today, so I appreciate you checking in. My name is Emma Wyatt, and today I was going to talk about the New Market Tax Credit Program, which is a really great program that a lot of our communities just aren't getting all the information about, and there's a lot of confusion when it comes to this really cool program. I work at People Incorporated. We are a community action agency headquartered in Abingdon, Virginia. We have almost 30 programs designed to give people a hand up rather than a hand out. These include programs such as our business loan and development services, affordable rental housing. We run the region's Head Start. And a lot of our services are done across the state. Our primary service areas are shown on this map in the blue locations, but we do have some services in these secondary areas as well. Our New Market Tax Credit Program, however, is quite small for our organization, but has just a tremendous impact on what we do. I'm the only full-time employee in this program for People Incorporated, but we have impact on 9 states. And I'll go over that service area later in the presentation, but it does include the entire state of Virginia. So I was going to, first of all, see where everyone is coming from today. So if you'll get out your cell phones and you text the number 22333 and put in your message Emma Wyatt 587, you'll be able to join in and text me where you're coming from today so I can have a better idea of where everybody's at. I'll give you a second to do it. So text to the number 22333. There is a finicky thing with the system that you have to put in your name, your whatever thing you're typing in as one word. So go ahead and put a dash between where you're typing from if you've got a two-worded answer. Okay, we have a lot of people from Chicago. Man, not even, I think I only see one answer from Virginia. So, well, there's 2. Wow, it's great to have everybody on today. It's this is a nationwide program, so that's good to know too. And we'll talk about some of where People Inc. serves. Wow, we have a lot of people on. That's great. Okay, well, we'll check back in later. Feel free to put in your answers. I'll get them later, but that's great to see so many people coming in today. So the New Market Tax Credit Program, the main purpose of it is to overcome false perceptions of market risk and general private sector investments in low-income communities that have traditionally had inadequate access to capital. It was created in the year 2000 by Congress as part of the Community Renewal Tax Relief Act, and it's codified in the Internal Revenue Code. Now, I would never suggest to anyone go read tax code in your spare time, but this is quite digestible tax code. It's only about 9 pages, and since we're going to have some time at home in the next few weeks, it might be something to reach out to. But the thought of the program is, if an investor is seeking their greatest return on investment, and they have the option between investing in a low-income community and a thriving community, 9 times out of 10, their greatest return is going to be in that thriving community. Because of the New Market Tax Credit Program, however, the program can offer a small federal incentive to leverage the private sector investment to make it more attractive to invest in low-income communities. This results in better market rates from this subsidy and in general allows a lot of projects that wouldn't be able to happen in these communities. It helps them come to fruition. Since the program started, there's been over $54 billion worth of new market tax credit put out into our communities across the United States. And one of the impact numbers is for every $1 of federal dollars that is spent on this program, it's about $8 of private sector investment. So it really does have a huge impact. So I'm going to run through just how the deals work, who are the players, and what their role is in the organization. So the CDFI Fund, that is the Community Development Financial Institution, it's part of the U.S. Treasury, is the group who runs this program through the federal government. Community development entities, or CDEs, submit applications to the CDFI Fund via a super competitive application process. requesting an allocation of new market tax credits. Now, if the application is accepted and tax credits are awarded, it's not actual cash that's coming to the community development entity. Rather, it's an allocation of tax credits that you can then sell. So the CDE sells their new market tax credits to investors. These are typically large banks such as US Bank or Chase or Wells Fargo, SunTrust. And these banks want to buy the tax credits because it allows them to take a 39% reduction in their tax liability. In turn, they pay a qualified equity investment, or QEI, to the community development entity in the form of money, which the CDE can then flow down to the projects. I assume the majority of the people on this call today are representing people who have a project that they want to get developed. So you'd be representing the Qualified Active Low-Income Community Business, or QALC-Bs. This program has the silliest acronym, so this will be fun. And the money that comes from the CDE is referred to as the QLICI, or the Qualified Low-Income Community Investment. The biggest thing to know about this program is, though, that new market tax credits are supposed to be gap financing. So it's the last money to the table. Therefore, there is a significant portion of the balance of what your project costs that has to come from leverage. So you can assume about 70% of your project costs needs to come from some sort of leverage, whether that's a commercial bank loan, a bridge loan, a grant, sponsor equity, tenant improvement contributions, whatever. And then the last 30% can come from that new market tax credit equity. I'll let this slide sink in for a second. If you want to take a screenshot, now would be the time. And I'll move on to the next slide, which I hope breaks it down a little more simple of how the deals work. Okay, so a CDE, a community development entity, will write an application saying, I want $100 million of allocation. The CDFI Fund will say, you did a great job, however, we're only going to give you $70 million. They say, okay, we have $70 million, we need to get this allocated to all kinds of different projects, and so they look around for different projects that all say they want new market tax credit financing. They find a project they want, it's $10 million, so they say, okay, cool, we'll give you $10 million in allocation, but let me go sell my tax credits. So they find an investor to buy those tax credits, and in turn they have money to then invest in the project. So it is a complicated process, but when you look at it from different ways of breaking it down, it is simple the way it flows through. There are a lot of players in the new market tax credit program. First, we'll talk about the investors. These are the people we said are the big banks, usually like US Bank, Chase, Wells Fargo, SunTrust. Some regional banks do participate. So if you are coming from the investor side of the new market tax credit program today, I hope to talk with you afterwards. This is pretty much anyone who has a significant tax liability and wants to take a 39% deduction in exchange for making these investments. The CDE acts as an intermediary vehicle for the provision of new market tax credits in these low-income communities. Basically, a CDE is an organization that has a primary mission of serving the low-income communities, and they do have to go through an eligibility process with the CDFI Fund. People Incorporated works as a CDE in our service area. And then the projects, the qualified active low-income community businesses, they could be really any business that wants to take advantage of this new market tax credit to do a project in a low-income community. So it could be a corporation, a nonprofit, it could be a partnership or a special purpose entity of a local government. There's a lot of different ways that you can structure who that QALC-B is. Okay, so once again, we'll pull out our phones. Which role in new market tax credits does your organization play? You should be able just to text, if you participated last time, just text back the number or the letter that fits your category. All right, so we have some CDEs here, we have projects that want to get funded. Other, we'll have to see what you guys are after the presentation. That's the majority of people here. All right, well, cool, we'll go from that. So qualified active low-income community business, QALC-B. What does that even mean? What do these letters stand for? So first of all, qualified active. To be a qualified active business, First of all, you can't be a sin business, which means you can't be a gambling facility, a massage parlor, a tanning salon. There's a whole list in that tax code we talked about that you can go and check out. There's certain alcohol establishments that are excluded. I have seen projects with breweries be funded though. And you also can't be an agricultural organization, mainly because there are federal programs out there designed to give money to agriculture programs. Second, you cannot be the majority of you cannot get all of your revenue from rental revenue. So you can have residential rental in your mixed, it can be a mixed use project, but at least 20% of the income for the project needs to come from something else like a restaurant or a grocery store. And then also for federal income tax purposes, there are special ways that your organization needs to be set up. Okay, so qualified, what does it mean to be active? We talked about a business needs to be a corporation or a partnership. Don't worry, people in local government, that does not exclude you from participating. There are certain requirements for the business and where they have to operate. So for example, you have to do your business within that low-income community. But mainly and most importantly, there is a 7-year compliance period with the new market tax credits. So you have to make sure that whatever you end up doing, whatever your project is, it has to be able to be viable for at least 7 years. Okay, so low-income community. This web link at the bottom of the screen is probably going to be a good tool for you all to go check out. This is a mapping tool that's pretty simple to allow you to see if your community is eligible for new market tax credits. I have Abingdon, Virginia pulled up here. So as you see, there's 3 colors on the map. The gray represents areas that are not eligible for investment. The pink is the severely distressed areas, so meaning that it is definitely eligible. And then the yellow means it's eligible as well. There are characteristics of distress that are determined by census tract. That's why the shapes are a little funky. They take into account the percent of people in poverty, the median income, the unemployment rate of that area in comparison to the national unemployment rate. And then they also take into some other characteristics, such as if it's a rural or urban area, if it's in the Appalachian Regional Commission's footprint, if it's a food desert. There's a lot of different things that are taken into account. So before you get too excited about a new market tax credit project in your community, I'd urge you to check out this map to see what qualifies. And I'll let you take a screenshot if you need to for that bottom web link before I move on. All right. And then last but not least, business. So what is eligible for a new market tax credit investment? There's all kinds of different ways to think about this, but mainly the program is designed to fund real estate development projects. So this includes acquiring a site, doing site prep, doing substantial rehabilitation, new construction, tenant build outs, and then there are some allowances for equipment and soft costs as well. The biggest thing we tell people when they're considering a project is, because transaction costs with new market tax credit projects are very, very high, we tend to tell people that a project isn't really viable unless it has $6 million of cost. So this program is designed for really large-scale community development projects. But don't feel like you are excluded if your project costs less. There are other ways that we could discuss getting funding. Okay, so we're going to flow through an average deal. This is not always the situation, but how the money flows through a deal. So a CDE like People Inc. will have $10 million of allocation they're going to give to a project. So they sell that tax credit allocation to an investor. The investor gets to take 39% reduction in their tax liability over a 7-year period. So in the first 3 years, they get to take 5% deduction. And in the last 4 years, they take a 6% for a total of that $3.9 million, which we got by multiplying 10 million times 39%. The investor then pays a market rate for the credit. We tend to tell people you can get anywhere between 75 and 90 cents per credit. Obviously, if you're a project you're a community that has a project, and you're going to want the investor to pay closest to $1 per credit as possible. So if you multiply the 0.82 by $3.9 million, you now now have $3.198 million of equity flowing into your investment fund. The investment fund pretty much needs to equal whatever that allocation was. So we need to have $10 million in this investment fund. So you need to come up with a leverage of $6.802 million to put in this investment fund. We'll go over some ways to find leverage later in the presentation, but like we said, it could be the bank loans, grant proceeds, it could be sponsor equity. So now we have $10 million in our investment fund. Woohoo! It will flow to the sub-CDE, and the sub-CDE will flow it to the project in the form of two loans. An A loan, which will mirror the terms of the leverage loan. So let's say you've got a bank loan for 5%. This would mirror that bank loan. And then the B loan, which is made up of the new market tax credit equity minus transaction costs. The good thing about this program is in the 7 years that you are in that compliance period, it's an interest-only repayment. Our interest rate, because it is blended, tends to be about 1.5%. The next cool part about this project is because the investor really isn't seeking to be returned on that B loan, the thing they wanted was the tax credits at the beginning of the deal. A lot of times that B loan will be forgiven. So you can think of, in a lot of cases, that $3.198 million as straight equity to your project. Now, this is not always 100% accurate, and that's something you have to discuss if you're a project with your CDE, but that's the way a lot of deals flow. I did mention transaction costs. Transaction costs will come out of the B loan, so they won't come out of the amount of money that you raised from your leverage, but they are significant. Basically, you're paying for the CDE's fees, you're paying for legal help and accountants, and it's very expensive. On a project we just closed, it was about $9.5 million of allocation. There was about $1 million of transaction costs. And that's why we say that a project really doesn't make sense unless it's over the $6 million mark, just so that you're actually getting some benefit from the tax credit and not just paying all these fees. People Incorporated has done 23 projects in the past about 10 years. We've done projects all across our service area, including manufacturing, hotels, performing arts venues, mixed-use facilities, training facilities. You can pretty much throw a stick and hit something that an industry we've helped with. Our new market tax credit program serves 9 states: Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, North and South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. And we do have a focus on rural Appalachian projects. So you see the Appalachian Regional Commission shown in blue on this map. There are CDEs all across the country, and I guess that's important to say since we have people coming from all over the United States. There are CDEs with allocation all over the nation, and some who have a nationwide footprint. So there's certainly a way you can find someone who fits your needs. And each CDE has goals that they try to meet with their investments. People Incorporated, we try to invest in projects that create high quality, accessible jobs. We try to build large scale community projects that build up assets. And then we always like projects that improve job training and education. So you're thinking about, you've got this great project and you need to find someone who would like to invest in it. How do you attract allocation? Well, first of all, if you have high compelling job creation, that would be a big part of your project success. A high probability of closing in a timely manner. So you've done a lot of your due diligence and your project is nearing completion, ready to be funded. If your project has strong community impact, it's always better. A low default risk. There's financial and project management capacity within your organization. And then also if you have compatibility with that CDE. So, if you came at People Incorporated with a solar energy project, we probably wouldn't be as happy about that as if you came to us with a work training facility project. But there's always CDEs around that have those different values that you can search. So what are some of the things that you need to have done for a project, a new market tax credit project, to be ready? When can new market tax credits come in, essentially? Now, this slide is designed to be a bit overwhelming for people who are working on projects. You need to have your environmental studies done and your zoning and your site plans and your plans and specs and your construction contracts and your leverage loan and your permits and your project appraisal, so many things. And like I said, this was supposed to be an overwhelming slide because there are a lot of consultants out there who can walk you through this process if you feel overwhelmed about the thought of getting all this together for your project to make sense. And you can Google those, they're all across the nation too. So we'll talk about some of the places that leverage can come from. This graphic is supposed to remind you that new market tax credits only cover that last remaining gap of your project. So the majority in that red color needs to come from some other source. Historic tax credits pair well with new market tax credits. The Virginia tax credit for rehabilitation is equal to 25% of the eligible costs and expenses. So if your building is listed on the National Register and you've gone through a Part 2 study, then this can be an eligible way to get leverage. Sponsor equity. A lot of the projects we deal with have a business or a high net worth individual who is leading the charge, and a lot of times they'll put their own money for the project. I have seen one successful opportunity zone paired investment with new market tax credits. It was not my project. I think it can work. I've seen only one, but it's an opportunity where we could be creative and see how the different funding sources work together. Bank loans. There are banks out there, especially in some of these rural places that specialize in new market tax credit lending. A lot of times projects that are seeking new market tax credits are not great candidates to receive a traditional bank loan, or potentially they'll receive a term sheet with terrible terms. So working with a CDE who is interested in giving you allocation is always a helpful way to secure a bank loan. Grants. In Virginia, the Appalachian Regional Commission and the Tobacco Commission often serve as grant providers for a lot of our rural projects. But there's all kinds of different grants that you can use. And then there's a whole list. You can contribute your property as part of the cost. Certain pre-development expenses will be eligible. There is a 2-year look-back period on new market tax credits. So if you've done those, let's say you bought your building last year and you want to close on new market tax credits this year, that could be an eligible source of leverage. Tenant improvement contributions, locality contributions, the list goes on. And really, this is a way for you to get creative on how to use the project's leverage. So let's go over some of the strengths and weaknesses of this program. The strengths. This is a low-cost capital during the 7-year compliance period, and it can help you finance that last remaining gap in your project. Weaknesses, though, because it is a really complicated process with a lot of professionals involved, they usually take at least 6 months to structure. So if you need to close tomorrow on your deal, it's probably not the best financing tool for you. We had said, this says $5 million, but we say between $5 and $6 million is your minimum deal size, just because transaction costs are so high. It is a very, very complicated deal structure. And oftentimes people will want to bring their legal consultants that they're comfortable with working with, but it is required that new market tax credit specifically, or tax credit lawyers and accountants are on this project to help you walk through the complexities of the deal. And with that said, tax expertise is necessary for the people who are closing the deal. That doesn't mean that your community who has never done this before can't achieve this goal of getting new market tax credits done. Opportunities. You have the opportunity to close that last remaining gap of an eligible project. Many CDEs structure the debt to be forgiven after that 7 years. You have the opportunity to create high quality jobs in your community. And as we had talked about before, you can shop around with investors who might pay the highest rate for the credits. You want to get to someone who will pay closest to $1 as possible. Threats, though. It is a 7-year reporting requirement. There are transactional fees. We discussed the high cost of those. And there is something called recapture. Of the $54 billion of new market tax credits that have been allocated, this has never, ever, ever happened in the history of the program. However, recapture is a risk that can happen if you essentially break your deal. So if you are receiving your money for the project and you take a vacation, that would lead to recapture. If the CDE you're working with ceases to be a CDE, that could lead to recapture too. So it's just something that we discuss with our projects before we actually get to closing a deal, and it is a very serious conversation that's had. Some project examples, that one we just recently closed on is in Johnson City, Tennessee. It was a high poverty community in Appalachia with high unemployment rates. It was the rehabilitation of an old flour mill into a mixed-use facility with restaurants and coffee shops and office space for local organizations. This was a $19 million project. So this was something I forgot to mention earlier, but on projects that cost this much money, a lot of times one CDE won't feel comfortable giving all of the allocation. So there will be 2 or sometimes 3 or 4 CDEs working together to provide allocation for a project. So this one had 2 CDEs. People Incorporated was one of them, and we worked with RBC out of Tennessee too. They had a lot of sources from their owners. They had their tenants who were occupying the building give contributions for their space. They had a construction loan from a local bank, and they do have a couple reimbursements that they had in the past 2 years in that look-back period. But some of the things they're going to be using this money for is to acquire the property, to complete a substantial amount of rehabilitation with site costs and their shell and their architecture and engineering and the whole list. They had their uses for their transaction closing costs, which were about $830,000 on a $19 million project. And they also were paying some of their new market tax credit fees. It's turning out great, though. You can see in the project on the left, that was about probably December or January when they were just beginning construction, and it's really starting to take shape. So it'll be a great addition to the Johnson City community. I feel like I flew through that, and that I might have a lot of space for questions in there, but that might be good. So that's the end of my content, and I'd be happy to answer any questions, but I will preface it with this. A lot of questions that you might have are probably going to be pretty project specific. So I'd be happy to follow up with you in an email or a phone call later this week. But anyway, let's hear them.
All right. Thank you again to Emma for that wonderful presentation. And thank you again for everyone who has joined us today. The poll system was very new, so I know that there were some kinks with people trying to text in, but thank you for those who were able to and participated. We will try to use that in the future because we liked how interactive that was. So I will now kind of go through our questions. I do see some questions regarding the conference. I will address that a little bit later in emails to everyone. Once we speak to kind of committees and everything, we will get more information out on that as well. So let me go through these questions. Okay, so our first question I see is investors putting in money are only concerned about what is in it for them and when can they get it back. On an average, how much time does it take for this process, all paperwork and approval of money, to take place? Also, what is the success ratio of this?
So I'll start with first the investors. Let me see if I can go back to that slide. The investors, yes, are definitely interested in getting the tax credit. That is their primary mission. A lot of times, of course, they go through the complicated underwriting to make sure that your business is going to be viable, but their main interest is going to be that tax credit equity they get from the new market tax credits. What was the next part of the question? I didn't write it down.
No, you're fine. I will reread it for you. So the first half was investors putting in money are only concerned about what is in it for them and when can they get it back. On an average, how much time does it take for this process to all paperwork and approval of money to take place? Also, what is the success ratio of this?
Okay, so then the last bit I'll say on about the investors is they are getting this return over that 7-year period. So their interest in getting those tax credits is over 7 years. The time frame to do all the paperwork and the necessary approvals is about 6 months if your project has gone through all of these steps. The more of the due diligence you do not have done before you approach a new market tax credit funder, the longer it's going to take. So I'm sure a lot of you have done projects that, you know, something in this long list causes a hold up in getting your project to move forward. But if everything's going well, we tend to say about 6 months. And then the last bit about the success ratio, all of the projects that we have like engaged an investor with have gone through, so 100%. But there's a lot of work that is done on the back end before we even introduce this project to an investor. So, you know, we'll work with projects and maybe they'll get all the way up to where they have their plans in place, but they're never able to find leverage, which is not an uncommon issue. So that would lead to a project never making it to that investment phase. But a lot of CDEs and consultants will help you walk through this process and make sure that your project is successful.
Okay. Not a question, but a compliment. Someone said, just wanted to say you did a great job explaining a very complicated thing.
Well, I appreciate it. The graphics help.
Our next question, have you ever used federal home loan bank funds as leverage?
I have not, because we have not done a ton of projects that involve residential components, but I'm sure they have been used. I would be leery of that just because there are a lot of projects. Okay, let me sort of back up. There is another tax credit program out there called Low Income Housing Tax Credits, and that's for developing residential real estate. So that's something that where federal home loan grant proceeds and other financing tools for residential real estate come into play. That's something that if you'd like to discuss more on, we do have a low income housing tax credit consultant in my office, and I'm sure that we can hook you up to answer some more questions on that.
I may have missed this, but are NMTCs available throughout the country?
Yes, and in all of our territories, such as Puerto Rico. New market tax credits are available nationwide. However, like I said, it's great to go and check out if your community is eligible using one of these mapping tools. There are many out there. This is not the only one. And you can see whether or not your community is eligible. Some places, for example, a lot of the places in my area of Southwest Virginia, the entire map will be red because it's an area of so much severe distress. And you find that in a lot of the low-income places across our country. You even find eligible pockets in large metropolitan areas that you think might be very successful. So don't rule your project out. Go ahead and check to see if you're eligible before you rule out your community.
Are any type of in-kind donations allowed for the match?
Yes. You know, we've seen projects. We're working with a project right now to where a nonprofit donated a building to a company to develop it for a project, and so the entire building's worth was eligible to be used as leverage. So there's a lot of different ways. It's something that it will be project specific, but as long as it's within that 2-year look back period, and the cost can be deemed eligible if it is if the contribution makes sense. It's hard to go in specifics based on what that contribution may be, but the short answer would be yes.
Can it be coupled with LIHTC?
There are projects, that's low income housing tax credits. There are projects that these two merge together. It doesn't work great. You have to have basically a structure to where part of the building is being funded by New Markets and the other part is being funded by LIHTC. And it's not great. However, New Markets does have the opportunity for some residential real estate, and it doesn't have to be, it can be market rate, it doesn't have to be affordable, but it can only make up 80% of that project's revenue. So you need to have some sort of other mixed use income coming in. But LIHTC and New Market have been paired, it's a clunky process.
Are environmental remediation costs specific to conditions within property parcel, i.e. no offsite impacts? Sorry.
I don't know if I understand the question very well. There is a phase 1 and phase 2 environmental assessment done on all projects. So you definitely would be required to clean up if there were issues. And another way of looking at that question is you can have eligible, let's say you get a brownfield grant, it can be used as your leverage. I'm not sure if I answered that, so if I didn't, please feel free to ask in a different way.
When does the NMTC program expire?
Well, currently it was set to expire in 2019, and I haven't seen anything saying that it got a full-on approval for the federal government to be in tax code forever. That's what a lot of people push for because this is such an impactful program. There is a lot of bipartisan support for this becoming a permanent part of tax code. I need to check back in and see if anything's been updated recently for the next round to be officially in tax code again.
Okay, probably most of us on this call are planning professionals working with municipalities, not necessarily working on specific projects. I'm watching this webinar to learn more about funding sources to point our stakeholders towards the revitalization projects. Can you give us examples of a few more of the types of projects that have successfully received funding?
Sure. So let me go back to one of my slides here. Just this program or this slide alone, there's a lot of projects that are hosted by the locality as its main program sponsor. So like the Historic Masonic Theater in Clifton Forge, that was a partnership between a lot of nonprofits and the local government in that small community. They were so creative in how they funded their project. There were grant funds. Every grant fund in the state of Virginia pretty much was in this project. They had historic tax credits. They had new market tax credits. They had everything you could think of. And there wasn't like a really rich person spurring that effort. The Bristol Hotel was another example of a really distressed community that was able to pull together a variety of different sources. Let me see, actually, I might have a couple more examples. One second. So we did a project, the Bristol Hotel. They had a bank loan of over $6 million. They had historic tax credits. They had one CDE, but they did have equity from their community can give money. They had state and historic tax credits actually, and the Virginia Tobacco Commission came in. We did a grocery store project in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. So it was like almost a strip mall with a grocery store as the main tenant and some other low-income community businesses that were in the strip. It had 2 CDEs. It had a bank loan. It had actually several different bank loans. The city was able to give some money. They had their realty service give some money to the project as well. If you have a project specifically you want to talk about, especially if you're a community and I know it's definitely hard. I come from the public sector as well. Finding lots of money to serve as your leverage can be just impossible. Feel free to give me an email and we can discuss different ways that we might find some creative leveraging for your project. It might be something that exists already, you're just not aware that can act as leverage.
Has anyone had issues getting the rest of the funding, moving forward with permits, etc., without this funding confirmed up front?
Yes, that is something. So a lot of times a CDE, like People Inc., will issue something, an LOI, a letter of interest to a project to help them go to banks and go to grant providers and say, hey, look, we have interest from a new market tax credit provider, which will fund the last bit of this project. You should give me a bank loan. That certainly helps. When we evaluate projects to determine whether or not we're going to give them an LOI, though, we're looking for serious commitment to the project. So, you have a community or a leader who is passionate about seeing it come through and is not going to let it fall. We look for the high quality job creation as part of your project, just a whole variety of things. And each CDE will look at different things before they give you an LOI, but it certainly does help. Like I had mentioned before, though, we have seen projects fall flat and stop because they weren't able to get all those things together. That's why it's great to have a consultant or to have someone, a CDE, who will work with you to help you walk through this process. And People Incorporated can act as a consultant as well. So if you're a group out there that's outside of our service area, we can act in the consultant capacity.
Thank you for the presentation. Just curious, where do you see some of the project ideas come from? Existing community plans, other sources?
Yeah, this is a great question. So there is a small network of professionals in this new market tax credit world. And so we know a lot of our neighboring CDEs and a lot of the places that have the same values as us. So a lot of times they'll see projects in their community and say, hey, we don't have any allocation right now. Would you guys be interested? That's probably a majority. We get a lot of calls from consultants trying to sell us projects essentially. But my job in particular is to help projects in rural Appalachia get through this complicated process. And so a lot of the time I spend is cold calling communities, and this is partially my cold call to you. If you're in my service area, please give me a call. I'd love to help you. But I do look at comprehensive plans to see if there's any concrete plans coming up in the future for a community. I look at urban development area plans really seriously. I read a lot of news articles and follow investors in local communities. So it's a variety of ways, but probably the number one way is through consultants.
Can you give an overall sense of the proportion of projects that are new construction versus redevelopment of existing structures?
The majority of the projects we've done have probably been rehabilitation, mainly because historic tax credits come in at such a huge piece of that leverage for those projects. We do a lot of new construction though. We just talked to a project this morning that is a new construction project. I don't even know if it's a 50-50 mix because every CDE will have a different portfolio of investments, but just in this slide alone, the Bristol Hotel was a rehab, the Historic Theater in Clifton Forge was a rehab, the Patrick Henry was a rehab, Rebuild West Liberty, that was helping a town after a tornado came through. CCAT, that was a new structure, and then the tire manufacturing plant you see, that was for equipment purchasing, and we were part of a much larger CDE investment, so we didn't even help build the building, we just helped them get the equipment they needed in their production line.
To answer the next question, this presentation will be uploaded to the APA chapters, APA Virginia chapters YouTube page, and an email will be sent out to everyone who participated today. So on to the next question. Please correct me if I'm wrong in my assumption that the NMTC is considered a federal program. That said, can a NMTC program work in tandem with a project that involves some aspect of service provision for veterans? I know from Grant's experience that sometimes you cannot get funding from one perceived federal source if there is another source that is federal. If that's too long of a question, we can connect you to get the answer through email.
This is definitely it is definitely a federal program. The beauty of this program and why it works so well is it is private sector ran, but it is a federal program, and we love to see projects that use different types of federal assistance in the same bundle. So certainly veteran programs are some CDEs focus explicitly on veteran services, so that's something we definitely can hook your project up with if you have something in mind.
Okay, going back to the environmental impacts question, what they meant by that is by offsite, sometimes environmental remediation can involve the pollution impacts from a project that may have traveled beyond the property itself, such as a chemical plume going into the water.
Sure. So if something turns up in the phase one that requires some sort of remediation, it will be necessary to do, but that doesn't mean a project can't happen at that site. So let's say downstream, you were getting some sort of chemical runoff from a company upstream. It would have to be corrected before your project could move forward. And there's a variety of different ways to correct that. We might have to get more specific on this to talk about the brownfield requirements of this program. So feel free to send me an email.
Okay. And one last question. Do localities have a role in the financing portion of the process, or is it primarily a planning function?
What was that last bit of the question? Is it primarily a what?
a planning function?
Oh, they play both roles. So if a locality is the sponsor of a project, they're going to play a huge role. They'll be on weekly conference calls, and they'll be the people who are spearheading the effort. For projects such as the model mill that we discussed in Johnson City, Tennessee, the only role that the community really played was approving the zoning permit, approving the building permit, and compliance with whatever local laws there are and codes. They did not have a financing portion for this project, but that doesn't mean that a community can't. If a community is passionate about a project that a private investor is leading, they certainly can be a leverage provider. But they can pretty much, the locality can be as involved or uninvolved as they want to be, or their investor who's leading the project wants them to be. But we have worked with localities who have acted as the project sponsor, so where they were doing everything. Currently, we're working on a project in West Virginia with an EDA, and they are having to go through, all of these complicated processes that we had talked about, this whole when is a project ready, all these due diligence steps. And it is a little more difficult because there are private or public sector requirements that the private sector doesn't have, such as bidding out the construction contract. That has taken, 3 times as long as someone in the private sector might have had, but that doesn't mean it's not going well. And it just takes a little bit longer for the government to serve as the project sponsor.
And can the NMTC be used on solar projects?
Yes, there are CDEs out there who specifically invest in solar projects. A quick Google search will probably turn them up. They're probably nationwide CDEs. People Incorporated hasn't done a solar project specifically, but if you have more questions or want to talk about your project, feel free to send me a message.
Okay, that looks like that was the last of our questions. Again, thank you, Emma, for this wonderful presentation, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. As a reminder, this webinar, like all of our webinars, will be posted to Chapter's YouTube page by the end of the day. So thank you again, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Thanks, everyone.